The door of the forge slammed open so hard that the iron tools on the wall shook and rattled against their hooks. Elara Finch spun around, hammer still in her hand, sparks dying on the anvil behind her. A man stood in the doorway, soaked in rain and blood that was not fully his own, his chest heaving, his eyes darting behind him as if something might still be following him through the dark. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I need help, now." Elara did not move at first. Strangers did not come to her forge at midnight, not in Millbrook, not ever. The town was small, quiet, and forgettable, tucked between two hills where nothing ever happened worth talking about. She had built her life around that quiet, but the man's eyes held something she recognized instantly, the look of someone who had run farther and faster than his body could bear. "Close the door," she said, setting down her hammer, "before you let the cold in with you." He obeyed, though his hands shook as he did it. He was young, maybe near her own age, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He carried something wrapped in a torn strip of cloth, holding it against his chest the way a mother might hold a child. "You're a smith," he said, though it was not really a question. He was staring at the anvil, the furnace glowing behind her, the racks of half-finished blades along the far wall. "I am Elara Finch. This is my forge." She kept her voice steady, though her pulse had picked up the moment she saw the dark stains on his sleeve. "What happened to you? There is no time to explain." He unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers, and what fell out into his palms made Elara's breath catch. It was a sword, or what remained of one. The blade had been broken clean through, snapped near the hilt, the edges jagged and strange. The metal itself looked wrong somehow, darker than steel should be, with a faint sheen that seemed to shift when the firelight touched it. "I need this fixed," he said. "Tonight, I cannot leave without it whole again." Elara stepped closer, studying the broken pieces without touching them yet. She had repaired hundreds of blades in her life, farm tools, hunting knives, the occasional ceremonial sword for a wedding or a festival. She had never seen metal like this. Symbols ran along what remained of the blade, faint and worn, almost like they had been pressed into the steel before it cooled, rather than carved afterward. "This isn't ordinary steel," she said slowly. "Where did you get this?" "It belonged to my family." He said it fast, like the words hurt to speak. "It has been in my bloodline longer than this town has existed. I cannot lose it. Not tonight, not ever. I don't even know your name." He hesitated, just for a moment, long enough that she noticed. "Cale," he finally said. "My name is Cale. Just Cale. No family name offered, no explanation for the blood on his sleeve, or the way his eyes kept flicking toward the small window near the door, as if he expected shadows to peel away from the darkness outside. Elara had learned, growing up the daughter of a smith who asks no questions of the men who paid him, that some silences were better left unfilled. She looked down at the broken sword again. "I don't usually take jobs this late," she said, "and I definitely don't take jobs from men who show up bleeding and refuse to say what happened." "I don't have coin," Cale admitted, and there was something almost like shame in the way he said it, a proud man forced into humility. "Not on me. Not now. But I will find a way to pay you, whatever it costs, whatever you ask. I only need the blade whole by morning." Elara studied him for a long moment. She should have said no. Every instinct her father had drilled into her, every lesson about strangers and danger, and the cost of getting involved in things that were not her business, told her to turn him away and bolt the door behind him. But there was something in the desperate steadiness of his gaze, something that did not match the panic in his hands, that made her pause. "Sit," she said finally, nodding toward the stool near the furnace. "Let me look at it properly." Relief broke across his face so suddenly it looked almost painful. He sank onto the stool, as if his legs had been waiting for permission to give out. Elara picked up the two halves of the blade, turning them carefully under the firelight. The metal was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that felt unnatural, and when her fingers brushed one of the faint symbols near the hilt, she felt a strange warmth pass through her skin, gone as quickly as it came. "This will not be easy," she said, mostly to herself. "The metal is unlike anything I've worked with. If I heat it wrong, it could crack further instead of joining." "You can do it," Cale said. It was not a question. There was something almost desperate in his certainty, as if he needed to believe it. more than he actually knew it to be true. "You don't know that." "I know enough," he said, and for the first time since he had burst through her door, a small, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I have seen a lot of things break beyond repair tonight. I would like to believe not everything has to stay that way." There was weight behind those words that Ilara did not fully understand, but she felt it anyway, a kind of grief tucked inside the sentence that had nothing to do with the sword in her hands. She set the broken pieces down on the workbench and reached for her tools. "I'll try," she said. "That's all I can promise. Trying." "That's more than I've had all night," Cale murmured, and he watched her with an intensity that made the back of her neck warm, though she told herself it was only the heat of the furnace. She worked quickly, stoking the fire higher, laying out her tongs and her smallest hammers, the ones meant for delicate work rather than brute force. As she prepared the forge, she found herself glancing at him every so often. He sat rigid on the stool, alert to every sound outside, flinching once when a branch scraped against the roof in the wind. Whatever he was running from, it had not stopped chasing him the moment he stepped through her door. It had simply paused at the threshold, waiting. "You should eat something," she said, nodding toward a small pot of stew still warm from her own dinner, earlier that evening. "You look like you haven't in days." "I haven't," he admitted. "Time has not exactly been generous to me lately." She ladled a bowl and set it beside him without another word, then turned back to the forge. As she worked, heating the first jagged edge of the broken blade, she asked the questions that had been building since he arrived, careful to keep her tone light, unthreatening. "Are you being followed?" He did not answer immediately. "It's complicated. Is someone going to come through that door looking for you?" "I hope not. But if they do, you should not be here when it happens." The bluntness of it startled her more than any evasive answer could have. She turned to look at him fully. Hammer paused mid-air. "That's not exactly reassuring." It wasn't meant to be. His eyes softened, just slightly. "I'm sorry. You didn't ask for any of this. If I had anywhere else to go, I would not have brought this to your door." "Why my door then? Millbrook is not exactly on the way to anywhere important." "That's precisely why," Cale said. "No one important comes here. No one important would think to look here." He glanced down at the bowl of stew, untouched in his hands. "I needed a place quiet enough that whatever I did next would not be noticed until it was already done." Ilara turned back to the forge, letting the heat of the fire fill the silence between them. She did not fully trust him, not yet, but there was something in the careful way he chose his words, weighing each one before he let it out, that told her he was not simply a criminal running from justice. There was a heaviness to him, an exhaustion that went deeper than one long night of running. It reminded her, oddly, of the way her father used to look after long seasons of work that never seemed to end. Work he never complained about, but that wore him down all the same. The first hour passed in careful, quiet labor. She heated the broken edges slowly, testing the metal's response before committing to any technique. It resisted her at first, the strange alloy refusing to soften the way ordinary steel would, staying stubborn and cold even under the hottest part of the flame. She adjusted her approach, lowering the heat, working the bellows with a gentler rhythm, coaxing rather than forcing. "It doesn't like being rushed," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "No," Cale said quietly, "it never has." Something in the way he said it made her look up. "You've seen it broken before?" He hesitated again, that same careful pause she was beginning to recognize as the shape of a secret being weighed. "Once," he said finally, "a long time ago. It was fixed then too, by someone who understood it far better than most." "What happened to them? The one who fixed it before?" His jaw tightened. "They're not able to help me anymore." She did not push further, sensing the door on that subject had closed as firmly as the one on his identity. Instead, she focused on the blade, letting the rhythm of the work settle her nerves. As the night stretched on, the strange metal slowly began to yield, the jagged edges softening under her care, the two broken halves inching closer to whole again with every careful strike. Cale watched her work in silence for a long while, his exhaustion visible in the slow droop of his shoulders, though he fought to stay upright, alert, watching the door as much as he watched her hands. Once, when a gust of wind rattled the shutters, he startled so violently that he nearly knocked the bowl of stew from his lap, his hand flying to his hip, as though reaching for a weapon that was not there. "You're safe here," Ilara said gently, though she was not entirely certain it was true. For now, at least. For now will have to be enough, he replied, forcing his shoulders to relax again, though his eyes did not leave the window for long. As the fire crackled, and the hours slipped by, Alara found herself studying him, between strikes of the hammer, trying to piece together the puzzle he presented. His clothes, though torn and stained, were finely made, the kind of stitching she had only seen on garments meant for people with far more coin than anyone in Millbrook. His hands, despite their trembling, were not the hands of a laborer. They were smooth, uncalloused, in the places where swordwork should have left marks. Yet there was an unmistakable confidence in the way he had carried the broken blade, as though it was an extension of himself rather than a mere possession. Whoever Cale was, he was not simply a traveler who had lost a fight with a bandit on the road. There was a story here, far larger than the one he was willing to share, and though every instinct told her to let it be, to fix the sword and send him on his way, without asking further questions, a smaller, more curious part of her wanted to understand exactly what kind of storm had walked through her door tonight. The blade began to take shape again beneath her hammer, the seam where it had broken slowly closing, the strange dark metal fusing back together in a way that almost seemed too smooth, too clean, as if the sword itself wanted to be whole again, and was simply waiting for the right hands to allow it. Alara told herself it was skill, nothing more, the years of practice finally showing their worth. But some small, quiet part of her wondered if there was something else at work, in the careful way the metal responded to her touch, something she did not yet have words for. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling against the shutters with a force that made both of them go still. Cale's hand drifted once more toward his hip, and this time Alara noticed the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, something sharp and controlled beneath the exhaustion, a readiness that did not belong to an ordinary man. "It's just the wind," she said quietly, though her own heart had begun to race. "I know," he said, though his body did not relax until several long seconds had passed. "Old habits. What kind of habits leave a person that jumpy?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if weighing how much of the truth she could bear to hear. "The kind that keep you alive," he said finally, "when everyone around you is trying very hard to make sure you don't stay that way." The words settled over the forge like a held breath, and Alara found she had no response for them. She turned back to the sword instead, letting the rhythm of hammer and heat carry her forward through the night, aware now more than ever that whatever she was building back together in her hands was only the smallest part of a much larger story, one that had not yet decided whether it would end in safety or ruin. Somewhere beyond the walls of her quiet little forge, danger was still moving through the dark, patient and unseen, and she had a growing feeling that fixing the sword was only the beginning of what this night would demand of her. The fire burned lower as the hours wore on, and still she worked, her arms aching, her focus narrowing to nothing but the blade and the strange, watchful man who had brought it to her. Whatever came next, she realized, she was already too far in to turn back now. The blade was whole an hour before dawn, though whole did not quite capture what Alara felt looking at it. The seam where the two pieces had joined was nearly invisible, a thin silver line running along the dark metal, like a scar that had healed better than it had any right to. She held it up to the dying firelight, turning it slowly, half expecting the join to give way under its own weight. It did not. The sword felt, if anything, sturdier than it had any reason to be, as though the break had never happened at all. "It's done," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, worn thin by hours of concentration and smoke. Cale rose from the stool so fast that he swayed, catching himself against the workbench before his legs fully steadied beneath him. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and took the blade from her hands with a reverence that startled her, cradling it the way one might cradle something fragile and precious, though a moment ago it had been nothing but broken metal. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the faint silver seam with one finger, his breath catching as he studied her work. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Alara found herself watching his face rather than the sword, curious what expression a man wore when something he believed lost forever was returned to him. "You have no idea what you've done," he finally said, and there was a rawness in his voice that had not been there before, something closer to disbelief than gratitude. "I fixed a sword," Alara said, trying to keep her tone light despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. "It's what I do." You didn't need to look so amazed. "This is not just a sword." He lifted his eyes to hers, and in the gray light beginning to creep through the shutters, She saw something in them she had not noticed before. A kind of old, careful sorrow, layered beneath the exhaustion. It has been in my family for generations. It was meant to break the night everything else did. I thought it was gone for good. What do you mean, everything else? He did not answer, and Alara had begun to expect that particular silence by now. The one that meant a question had strayed too close to something he was not ready to say aloud. Instead, he sheathed the blade in a scabbard she had not noticed him carrying, strapped across his back beneath his torn cloak, and turned it so the hilt sat properly against his spine, as though the motion was so familiar it required no thought at all. I owe you a debt I cannot easily repay, he said. You worked through the night for a stranger, who gave you nothing but a broken blade, and a handful of questions I refused to answer. That is not a small thing. It didn't feel like much of a choice, Alara admitted, wiping soot from her hands with a rag. You looked like you would have collapsed if I'd turned you away. Perhaps, Kale said, but you still could have turned me away. Many would have. He reached into the inner pocket of his cloak and withdrew something small. A ring, plain in design, but clearly old, its metal worn smooth by years of handling. He held it out to her, his hand steadier now than it had been all night. It is not much, he said, but it is worth more than it looks. Please, take it. I cannot leave without offering you something. Alara looked at the ring, then at his face, and shook her head. I don't want payment for helping someone who needed it. Keep your ring. Find whoever gave it to you and tell them you kept it safe. You don't understand, Kale said, an edge of frustration creeping into his voice, though it was not directed at her. Debts like this are not meant to go unpaid. Where I come from, a kindness like yours carries weight. If I leave here without settling it, it will follow me. Then consider it settled by you finding your way home safely, Alara said, softer now, sensing the tension beneath his insistence was not simple pride, but something closer to fear, as if leaving a debt unpaid might genuinely cost him more than coin. That's all the payment I need. Just be careful. Whatever you're walking back into. He studied her for a long moment, the ring still held out between them, before slowly closing his fingers around it again, and tucking it back into his cloak. You are either very foolish or very brave, he said, though there was no insult in the words, only something like admiration. I have not decided which. Maybe a bit of both, Alara said, allowing herself a tired smile. Most Smiths are. Outside, the first gray light of dawn had begun to spill over the hills, turning the mist that clung to Millbrook's rooftops into something silver and soft. Kale moved toward the door, then paused, his hand resting on the frame, his back to her. I never asked your name properly, he said. Not really. Alara, was it? Alara Finch, she confirmed. Alara Finch, he repeated, as though committing it carefully to memory, the way a man might memorize the coordinates of a place he intended to return to. I will not forget this. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that. What is happening next? She asked, unable to help herself, the curiosity that had been building all night, finally breaking through her restraint. You still haven't told me who's after you, or why, or what any of this is really about. He was quiet for a moment, his hand tightening slightly on the doorframe. There are things happening beyond this town that you are better off not knowing, he said finally. Not because I don't trust you, because knowing them would put you in danger, and you have already risked enough for me tonight. That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now, he said, and there was real regret in his voice. But if the day comes when I can give you a better one, I will. Before she could respond, he stepped through the door and into the pale morning light, his cloak settling around him, the newly repaired sword a dark line across his back. He did not look back, though he paused at the edge of the road for just a moment, as if steadying himself for whatever waited beyond the hills. Then he was gone, swallowed by the mist and the early morning quiet, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of rain and iron, and the strange, unshakable feeling that she had just been part of something far larger than she understood. Alara stood in the doorway of her forge for a long while after he disappeared, watching the empty road, as the sun climbed higher, painting the mist gold. She told herself she should feel relieved. The stranger was gone, the danger he carried with him gone with him, her quiet life undisturbed, and yet the relief did not come. Instead, there was a strange hollow feeling in her chest, a sense that something important had happened, and then walked out the door before she could understand what it meant. She went back inside eventually, the cold morning air finally driving her indoors, and found herself staring at the empty stool where he had sat through the long hours of the night. The bowl of stew sat untouched beside it, gone cold. She picked it up, meaning to pour it out, then stopped, staring at the faint impression left in the cushion of the stool, where he had been sitting only minutes before. It was foolish, she told herself, to feel anything at all about a stranger who had given her nothing but a broken sword and a handful of half-answers. She had helped people before, without expecting anything in return, had spent her whole life following her father's example of quiet generosity toward anyone who needed a blade fixed or a tool repaired. This should have felt no different. And yet it did. She spent the following days trying to push the memory of him from her mind, throwing herself into her work, with a focus that bordered on obsession. She fixed plow blades for the farmers on the edge of town, repaired a set of kitchen knives for the baker's wife, sharpened the hunting knives belonging to a group of trappers preparing for the coming season. Each task was familiar, grounding, the kind of work that had defined her life, since she was old enough to hold a hammer. But even as her hands moved through motions she knew by heart, her mind kept drifting back to the strange metal of that broken blade, the faint symbols that had seemed to pulse with warmth beneath her fingers, the careful, guarded way Cale had spoken about things happening beyond the borders of her small, quiet town. On the third day, she heard the first whispers. A traveling merchant, passing through Millbrook on his way south, mentioned something over a meal at the local tavern that made Alara's ears prick up despite herself. Unrest, he said, in the Northern Territories. Talk of a broken pack, a fractured leadership, a king who had vanished under circumstances no one seemed willing to explain in detail. The merchant spoke of it the way people spoke of distant storms, interesting, but ultimately none of their concern, a piece of gossip to pass the time, rather than a warning to be heeded. Alara listened without comment, her stew growing cold in front of her, her mind racing through everything she had noticed about Cale that night, the fine stitching of his ruined clothes, the confidence in his hands despite the trembling, the way he had spoken of debts as though they were sacred obligations rather than simple courtesies. The hunted look in his eyes that had nothing to do with an ordinary chase through the woods. She told herself it was coincidence. Millbrook was far from the Northern Territories, far from any kind of conflict grand enough to be worth a traveling merchant's gossip. There was no reason to believe the stranger who had walked into her forge was connected to any of it. But some part of her, the same part that had felt the strange warmth beneath her fingers as she worked the broken blade, was not so certain. She returned to her forge that evening with the merchant's words still echoing in her mind, and though she tried to focus on the work in front of her, her eyes kept drifting toward the door, toward the road beyond it, half expecting to see a familiar figure appear out of the mist once more. The road remained empty. The night passed in ordinary silence, the fire crackling, the tools hanging still on their hooks. But something in her had shifted, a quiet certainty settling into her bones that this was not the end of the story that had begun the night the stranger stumbled through her door. It was only the beginning, and whatever came next, she suspected, would not wait much longer to arrive. A week passed, and Millbrook returned to its usual rhythm, or so it seemed on the surface. Farmers brought their tools for sharpening. Children chased each other through the market square, and the baker's wife complained loudly about the price of flour to anyone who would listen. Alara moved through her days with practiced ease, but underneath the routine, something restless had taken root in her, a low hum of awareness that refused to settle, no matter how hard she worked. She found herself watching the road more than usual, glancing up from her anvil at every sound of hooves or wheels, though she told herself each time that she was simply being careful, that a woman running a forge alone should always keep an eye on who was passing through. It had nothing to do with the stranger who had disappeared into the morning mist a week before. Nothing at all. It was on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, that Wren Callahan came running into the forge, breathless and wide-eyed, her basket of market goods forgotten somewhere behind her. Wren was the closest thing Alara had to a friend in Millbrook, a sharp-tongued young woman who ran the town's small apothecary and had never once been shy about speaking her mind. "You need to come see this," Wren said, gripping Alara's arm before she had even fully caught her breath. "Now, before it's gone." "See what?" Alara set down the tool in her hand, alarmed by the urgency in her friend's voice. "Riders," Wren said. "At the edge of town. A dozen of them, maybe more, all dressed like they walked straight out of a story. Banners and everything. People are saying they're looking for someone. Ilara's stomach dropped before her mind had even finished processing the words. She followed Ren out into the street without bothering to remove her leather apron, weaving through the small crowd that had already begun to gather near the town's entrance, drawn by the same curiosity that had pulled Ren away from her shopping. The riders were impossible to miss. A dozen men on tall, dark horses, dressed in armor that gleamed even under the overcast sky, banners snapping in the wind, above them bearing an emblem Ilara did not recognize, a stylized wolf's head wreathed in flame. They moved through the town with a precision that spoke of discipline, their eyes scanning the buildings and faces around them, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Ilara's neck rise. At the front of the group rode a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his jaw, his expression carved from stone as he surveyed the gathered townsfolk. He raised a hand, and the riders behind him came to a halt in near-perfect unison. "We are searching for a man," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. "Dark-haired, travels alone, may be injured. He would have passed through recently, perhaps within the last 2 weeks. Anyone with information will be rewarded generously. Anyone found hiding him will not be treated so kindly." The threat, thinly veiled beneath the promise of reward, sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Ilara felt Ren's grip tighten on her arm, and she forced herself to keep her expression neutral, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain someone nearby must be able to hear it. "You know something," Ren whispered, barely audible, her eyes fixed forward, even as the words were meant only for Ilara. "I can tell. What happened?" "Not here," Ilara murmured back, her voice tight. The scarred rider's eyes swept over the crowd, pausing for just a moment too long on Ilara's face, before moving on. She did not know if it was suspicion or simple chance, but the weight of that gaze lingered long after he had looked away, settling into her chest like a stone. No one in the crowd offered any information, whether out of genuine ignorance or the town's quiet, long-standing distrust of outsiders, who arrived making threats disguised as offers. Eventually, seemingly satisfied that Millbrook held nothing of value, the riders turned their horses and continued down the road, their banners disappearing over the hill in the direction Kale had vanished a week before. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, already turning the strange visit into the kind of story that would be repeated in the tavern for weeks to come. Ilara pulled Ren aside the moment the crowd had thinned, drawing her into the narrow alley beside the forge where they would not be overheard. "Talk," Ren said immediately. "Right now. What do you know?" Ilara hesitated, weighing how much to share even with someone she trusted. But the sight of those riders, the barely concealed threat in the scarred man's voice, had shaken something loose in her, a growing certainty that whatever secret Kale carried was far more dangerous than she had allowed herself to believe. "A man came to my forge," she said finally, keeping her voice low. "Late at night, about a week and a half ago. He was injured, running from something. He had a broken sword, unusual metal, symbols I didn't recognize. I fixed it for him. He left before dawn, and I haven't seen him since." Ren's eyes widened. "You think that's who they're looking for?" "I don't know. Maybe. The timing fits." Ilara ran a hand through her hair, frustration and worry tangling together in her chest. "He wouldn't tell me who he was, or what he was running from, just that it was dangerous, and that I was better off not knowing." "Well, apparently the not knowing followed you anyway," Ren said grimly. "Those men were not simple bandits or hired thugs. Did you see the craftsmanship on those banners? That kind of quality doesn't come cheap. Whoever they're working for has real money, real power." "I know." Ilara's mind raced back to the strange sensation of the sword beneath her hands, the warmth that had passed through her fingers when she touched the faded symbols, the fine stitching of Kale's ruined clothes, despite his claim of having nothing to offer as payment. Pieces that had seemed disconnected before were beginning to arrange themselves into a shape she did not entirely want to see. "Do you think he's in danger?" Ren asked, softer now, some of her usual sharpness giving way to genuine concern. "I think whatever he's running from is a lot bigger than anything that happens in Millbrook," Ilara said quietly, "and I think those riders mean exactly what they said. If they find him, or find anyone who helped him, it won't end well." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over them both. Ren finally reached out and squeezed Alara's hand, a small gesture of solidarity that Alara appreciated more than she could easily express. "You should be careful," Ren said. "If that scarred man remembers your face, or if word gets back to whoever sent them that a smith in Millbrook fixed a mysterious sword recently, you could become a target too." "I know," Alara admitted, the truth of it settling uncomfortably in her stomach. But what was I supposed to do? Turn away a wounded man because helping him might be inconvenient? "No," Ren said, shaking her head firmly. "That's not who you are, and I wouldn't want you to be. I'm just saying, keep your eyes open. Trouble has a way of finding people who've already been noticed once." Alara nodded, though the reassurance did little to settle the unease coiling tighter in her chest with every passing minute. She returned to her forge that evening with a new wariness threaded through her usual routine, checking the lock on her door twice before finally settling in for the night, listening to every sound outside with an attentiveness she had never needed before. Sleep came slowly and fitfully, filled with fragmented images of scarred faces and gleaming armor, and a dark-haired stranger disappearing into mist that never seemed to clear. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding from a dream she could not fully remember, and lay in the darkness listening to the quiet creak of her small home settling around her, wondering, not for the first time, exactly what kind of storm she had unknowingly welcomed through her door. The days that followed brought no further sign of the riders, and slowly, cautiously, the town's unease began to fade back into its usual rhythms. But Alara found she could not fully relax, the memory of the scarred man's lingering gaze, staying with her long after the immediate fear had passed. She threw herself into work, as she always did, but now every stranger who passed through Millbrook drew a second glance. Every unfamiliar sound at night sent her hand reaching instinctively for the nearest tool that could double as a weapon. She told herself, over and over, that Cale was gone, that whatever debt or danger he carried had left with him, that her involvement in his story had ended the moment he walked out her door and disappeared into the morning mist. But some quiet, persistent part of her did not believe it, and as the days stretched into a second week, she began to understand that belief had little to do with what was actually coming. Trouble, as Ren had warned her, had a way of finding people who had already been noticed once. And somewhere beyond the hills that ringed her small, quiet town, Alara suspected the storm she had helped to mend was only just beginning to gather its full strength. 16 days after the riders had passed through Millbrook, the sound of a single horse approaching the forge pulled Alara away from her work in the middle of the afternoon. She set down the blade she had been sharpening and moved to the window, half expecting to see the scarred man returning with sharper questions and less patience than before. Instead, she saw a rider she did not recognize at all, a young man in plain traveling clothes, his horse lathered with sweat as though it had been pushed hard for many miles. He dismounted quickly, glancing around the street before approaching her door with the careful, deliberate steps of someone delivering news they were not entirely comfortable carrying. "Are you Alara Finch?" he asked, once she had opened the door. "I am. Can I help you?" He hesitated, then reached into his satchel and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize, an image of a wolf's head that made her breath catch, echoing the emblem she had seen on the riders' banners weeks before. "I was asked to deliver this to you personally," he said, "and to wait for your response, if you have one." Alara took the letter with hands that were not quite steady, breaking the seal carefully and unfolding the parchment. The handwriting inside was precise, controlled, though something about the pressure of the pen suggested it had been written in haste. "Alara Finch, I have not forgotten what you did for me, and I have not forgotten the debt I owe you. Circumstances have changed since I left your forge, circumstances I was not able to explain that night, and I find myself in need of your particular skill once again, though for reasons far greater than a single broken blade. I understand if you choose not to respond. What I am about to ask carries real risk, and I would not blame you for refusing. But if you are willing to hear more, the messenger who carries this letter can guide you to a safe meeting place, somewhere Millbrook's ordinary business will not be disturbed by whatever follows me. Whatever you decide, please know that the gratitude I carry for that night has not faded, and will not fade, regardless of your answer. Cale." Alara read the letter twice, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension that she could not fully untangle. He was alive. Whatever the riders had been searching for, Whatever danger had chased him through the night he first appeared at her door, he had survived it, at least long enough to write these careful, guarded words. "He's alive," she murmured, mostly to herself, before looking up at the young messenger, waiting patiently on her doorstep. "You said you're meant to guide me somewhere, if I choose to respond." "Yes," the messenger confirmed. "Though I should tell you, the location is not close. It would mean traveling for the better part of a day, and I cannot guarantee complete safety along the way." Kale was very clear that the choice must be entirely yours, made with full understanding of the risk. Ilara glanced back toward her forge, the familiar tools hanging on their hooks, the anvil that had been her father's before it was hers, the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself in Millbrook's forgotten corner of the world. Every practical instinct told her to write a polite refusal, to close the door on whatever storm Kale was still weathering, and return to the safety of routine. But the memory of his desperate eyes that first night, the raw gratitude in his voice when he saw the blade whole again, the strange warmth she had felt beneath her fingers as she worked the ancient metal, all of it pulled at her with a force she found difficult to resist. Whatever was happening, she had already been drawn into its edges the moment those riders passed through her town asking questions. Perhaps understanding it fully, rather than remaining willfully ignorant, was the wiser path after all. "Give me a moment," she said to the messenger. "I need to close up the forge properly before we leave." Relief flickered across the young man's face, quickly replaced by something more businesslike. "Of course. I'll wait." Ilara moved through the forge with quick, efficient motions, banking the fire, securing her tools, gathering a small bag of supplies she thought might prove useful, a few basic repair tools, a warm cloak, a knife she kept for practical purposes rather than any real skill in using it as a weapon. She left a brief note for Wren, tucked beneath a loose stone near the apothecary's back door, explaining only that she had gone to help someone and would return as soon as she could. Without offering details she was not entirely certain she should commit to paper. The journey began under a sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it, the messenger leading her along a winding path that avoided the main road entirely, cutting instead through forest trails that grew increasingly unfamiliar as the hours passed. Ilara found herself watching the trees more than the path ahead, her mind circling back again and again to the questions she still had no answers for. "Can you tell me anything?" she finally asked, as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, "about who he is, or what's happening?" The messenger glanced back at her, weighing how much he was permitted to share. "I can tell you that things have grown more complicated since he passed through your town," he said carefully, "and that the people searching for him are not going to stop, no matter how long it takes them." "Who is searching for him, and why?" "That," the messenger said, "is a story better told by Kale himself. I would not want to get any of the details wrong." Ilara accepted the deflection with a frustrated sigh, though she understood the caution behind it. They continued in near silence for another hour, the forest growing denser around them, the light fading toward the deep blue of early evening, by the time they finally emerged into a small clearing tucked between two rocky outcroppings, hidden well enough that Ilara doubted she could have found it again without guidance. A modest camp had been established there, a handful of tents arranged around a carefully banked fire, a few armed figures moving quietly between them, with the disciplined efficiency of people accustomed to needing to break camp and disappear at a moment's notice. Ilara's pulse quickened as she scanned the faces, searching for the one she had spent the last 2 weeks trying not to think about. She saw him before he saw her, standing near the fire with his back turned, deep in quiet conversation with an older woman, whose weathered face carried the kind of authority that came from decades of hard-earned experience. He was dressed differently now, in clothes that fit him properly, rather than the torn, blood-stained garments he had worn the night they met, and even from behind, something in his posture had changed, straighter, more certain, though there was still a tension in his shoulders that suggested the danger following him had not eased in the slightest. The messenger cleared his throat, and Kale turned, his eyes finding Ilara's across the clearing, with an intensity that made her breath catch despite herself. Whatever exhaustion had defined him that first night was gone, replaced by something sharper, more focused, though the warmth in his expression when he saw her had not diminished at all. "You came," he said, crossing the clearing quickly, stopping just short of the distance that would have felt too familiar for two people who barely knew each other. "I wasn't certain you would." "I almost didn't," Ilara admitted honestly. But I wanted answers, and it seemed you were finally willing to give them. I am, he said, and something in his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before, a readiness to lay down the careful silences he had maintained during their first meeting. Though I should warn you, the answers are not simple, and once you have them, there will be no pretending you don't know what I am about to tell you. I think I stopped being able to pretend the moment a dozen armed riders showed up in my town asking questions, Ilara said dryly, and something like a genuine smile broke across Cale's face, brief but real. Fair enough. He gestured toward the fire, where the older woman still stood watching them with careful, evaluating eyes. Come, sit. There is a great deal to explain, and very little time to explain it in. Ilara followed him toward the fire, aware of the weight of several watchful eyes tracking her movement through the camp, aware too of the strange, unshakable feeling that she was standing at the threshold of something far larger than the quiet life she had left behind in Millbrook. Whatever truth waited for her at that fire, she suspected there would be no simple way to walk back from it once it was spoken aloud. She settled onto a low stone near the flames, and Cale sat across from her, his expression settling into something serious and deliberate, the careful mask of a man about to reveal a truth he had guarded fiercely for a very long time. Everything I told you that night was true, he began. As far as it went, I simply left out the parts that mattered most. Ilara said nothing, waiting, the fire crackling softly between them as the last light of day faded fully into darkness around the hidden clearing, and the story she had unknowingly become a part of finally began, in full, to unfold. My family has led the Northern Territories for longer than anyone alive can accurately remember, Cale said, his eyes fixed on the fire, rather than on Ilara, as though it were easier to speak the truth to the flames than directly to her face. We are not like the people you know in Millbrook. My bloodline carries an old strength, passed down through generations, tied to the land, and to the pack that has followed my family's leadership since before these mountains had names. Ilara listened without interrupting, though her mind was already racing to catch up with the implications of what he was describing. Pack, bloodline, old strength. The words carried a weight that suggested something far beyond ordinary politics or inheritance. You mean you're some kind of noble? She said carefully, testing the shape of the idea aloud. More than that, Cale said, finally meeting her eyes. My father was the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, not a ceremonial title, a true leader, bound to his people by something deeper than law or tradition. When he ruled, the packs were unified, strong, protected from the kind of chaos that has torn apart other territories over the years. Was, Ilara repeated quietly, catching the past tense. Cale's jaw tightened. 6 months ago, my father was betrayed by his own brother, my uncle, a man named Silas, who had spent years quietly building alliances within the pack, currying favor, positioning himself for a moment of weakness he could exploit. That moment came during a diplomatic gathering, meant to renew peace between our territory and a neighboring pack. My father was killed that night, along with most of his personal guard, in an attack made to look like the work of outside enemies. I'm sorry, Ilara said softly, and she meant it, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of what he was describing. Silas moved quickly after that, Cale continued, his voice hardening with the effort of controlling old grief. He claimed the attack had been orchestrated by rival packs, used the chaos and fear that followed to consolidate his own power, positioning himself as the natural successor, while grief still had the rest of us reeling. I was meant to inherit my father's place. I was next in line, trained for it my entire life, but that night, in the confusion following the attack, I was nearly killed as well. By your uncle? By men loyal to him, though nothing could ever be proven directly. I barely escaped with my life, badly wounded, my family's ancestral blade shattered in the fighting. I fled north first, then east, moving from place to place, staying only long enough to heal enough to keep running. That was how I ended up bleeding on your doorstep, carrying a broken sword that meant more to me than my own life. Ilara sat with the weight of this for a long moment, pieces of the puzzle finally settling into a shape that made a terrible kind of sense. The fine stitching of his ruined clothes despite his claimed poverty, the desperate insistence that the sword be repaired that very night, the haunted look in his eyes that had nothing to do with an ordinary chase through the woods. The sword, she said slowly. It's not just sentimental, is it? It means something more. Cale nodded, a faint, tired respect flickering across his expression at her quick understanding. It has been carried by every Alpha King in my bloodline since the founding of our territory. It is bound to our family in ways I do not fully understand myself, tied to old magic that predates written history. Without it whole, I cannot formally challenge Silas for leadership, cannot prove my claim before the pack elders in the way tradition demands. Losing it meant losing any legitimate path back to my father's throne. And you think that's why he sent riders after you, not just to eliminate a rival, but because he knows you're trying to reclaim the sword? I think, Cale said carefully, that Silas has spent every day since my father's death, terrified that I am still alive, still capable of rallying enough support to challenge his claim. A broken sword suggested I had lost everything, that I posed no real threat. A whole sword suggests something very different. The fire popped softly between them, sending a small shower of sparks upward into the darkening sky. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of just how far outside her ordinary life this conversation had carried her, and just how dangerous the knowledge she now possessed had become. "Why tell me all of this now?" she asked. "You could have simply thanked me and let me return to Millbrook without any of this. Why bring me all the way out here?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with visible care. "Because the sword alone is not enough," he finally said. "The elders who will judge my claim require more than a repaired blade. They require proof of its authenticity, proof that the metal itself has not been tampered with or replaced by a lesser imitation. There are very few smiths alive who understand the old techniques well enough to work with that metal at all. Your hands did something to that blade I have never seen accomplished so quickly, so cleanly. I need you to testify before the elders, to explain exactly how you repaired it, to prove that the sword is genuine." Alara stared at him, the request settling over her with a weight that made her chest tighten. "You want me to walk into the middle of a political struggle for control of an entire territory? I know what I am asking," Cale said, and there was real regret in his voice now, the confident authority of his earlier explanation giving way to something more vulnerable. "I know it is an enormous risk, and I would not blame you at all for refusing, but without your testimony, my claim may not hold, and if it fails, Silas will hold the northern territories indefinitely, ruling through fear, rather than the strength and fairness my father always tried to embody. And if I agree, and it goes badly, what happens to me?" "I will not let that happen," Cale said firmly, though Alara noted he did not, could not, fully promise her safety. No one in his position could make guarantees like that honestly, not with an enemy as ruthless as the one he had described. "I will do everything in my power to protect you, both during the proceedings and afterward, but I cannot pretend there is no danger. I owe you the truth, even when the truth is difficult to hear." Alara looked past him, toward the small camp settling into the quiet routines of evening, the armed figures moving with disciplined purpose between the tents, the older woman who had been speaking with Cale when she arrived, now watching their conversation from a respectful distance, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Who is she?" Alara asked, nodding toward the woman. "Ivy," Cale said. "She served as my father's closest advisor for 20 years, and mine as well since his death. She is one of the very few people I trust completely in this." As if summoned by her name, Ivy approached the fire, settling onto a low seat beside Cale, with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, studied Alara with open curiosity. "So this is the smith," Ivy said, her voice carrying a warmth that softened the intensity of her gaze. "Cale has spoken of little else since he returned to us with that blade whole again. I confess, I expected someone older." "I get that a lot," Alara said, managing a small, tired smile despite the weight of the conversation. "Whatever you decide," Ivy said, turning serious again, "know that Cale is right to be cautious about the danger, but he understates how much your testimony could mean. The elders are not fools. They will recognize authentic work when they see it demonstrated properly. Your presence could tip the balance in ways that matter far beyond a single sword." Alara sat quietly for a long moment, the fire casting shifting shadows across the faces watching her, waiting for an answer she had not yet fully found within herself. The safe, sensible choice was to return to Millbrook, to close the door on this dangerous, sprawling conflict, and let it resolve itself without her involvement. But the memory of Cale's desperate gratitude that first night, the quiet suffering beneath his careful explanations tonight, the simple, undeniable truth that a good man's rightful claim hung in the balance against a tyrant who had murdered his own brother for power, all of it pulled at something in her that she could not easily ignore. "I need time to think," she said finally, honestly. "This isn't a small thing you're asking." "Of course," Cale said immediately, relief and understanding mingling in his expression. "Take whatever time you need. We will not force you into anything." Ilara nodded, grateful for the space, though even as she said the words, some quiet part of her already suspected what her answer would eventually be. The fire burned on into the night, and around it, the camp settled into watchful rest, while far to the north, in halls she had never seen, a usurper king continued to tighten his grip on a throne that was never rightfully his to claim. Ilara did not sleep well that night, lying awake in a borrowed tent while the sounds of the camp settled slowly into quiet around her. The occasional murmur of a guard's voice, or the shift of horses tethered nearby, the only interruptions to the deep forest silence. She turned Cale's request over and over in her mind, weighing the danger against the pull of something she could not fully name, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with a feeling that had rooted itself in her chest the moment she watched him take the repaired blade into his trembling hands. By the time gray morning light began to filter through the canvas above her, she had made her decision, though the weight of it still sat heavy in her stomach as she emerged from the tent to find Cale already awake, standing near the fire with a cup of something warm cradled in his hands, his eyes distant with thoughts she could not read. "I'll do it," she said, before she could talk herself out of it again. "I'll testify before the elders." Cale turned to face her fully, surprise and gratitude warring across his expression. "Are you certain? I meant what I said last night. You are not obligated to carry any part of this burden." "I know," Ilara said, "but I've had all night to think about it, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. If I walk away now, and Silas keeps that throne through fear and murder, I don't think I'll be able to live with knowing I could have helped and chose not to. That's not who I want to be." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a mixture of relief and something deeper, more complicated, that he did not put into words. "Thank you," he said simply. "I will not forget this, Ilara. Whatever comes of it, I promise you that." Ivy emerged from her own tent moments later, taking in the scene with a knowing look that suggested she had anticipated Ilara's answer all along. "Good," she said briskly, already moving into planning mode. "Then we have a great deal to prepare, and very little time to prepare it in. The elders' gathering begins in 4 days' time, and the journey to the northern hall will take most of that." The camp shifted quickly into purposeful motion, tents folded and packed with practiced efficiency, supplies distributed among the small group that would make the journey north. Ilara found herself swept along in the organized chaos, given a sturdy horse to ride alongside Cale and Ivy, while the remaining guards fell into formation around them, alert and watchful in every direction. The journey north proved harder than Ilara had anticipated, the terrain growing rougher and colder with each passing day, forests giving way to rocky hills and finally to the beginnings of mountain country, where the air carried a sharp bite even during daylight hours. She had never traveled so far from Millbrook in her life, and despite the danger hanging over every mile, she found herself struck by an unexpected sense of wonder at landscapes she had never imagined seeing with her own eyes. Cale rode beside her often during the long hours of travel, and slowly, gradually, the careful walls between them began to soften. He spoke more freely now, telling her stories of his childhood in the northern hall, of a father whose strength had never diminished his kindness, of a mother who had died when he was young but whose memory still shaped the way he tried to lead. Ilara found herself sharing pieces of her own life in turn, stories of her father's forge, the quiet satisfaction of honest work, the small, ordinary joys of a life built around routine and craftsmanship. "You loved him very much," she said one evening, as they sat slightly apart from the rest of the camp, watching the last light fade behind distant peaks. "Your father. More than I've ever properly told anyone," Cale admitted. "He was not a perfect man. No one who holds real power ever manages to be. But he tried, every day, to lead with fairness rather than fear, and that mattered to the people who followed him. Silas has already begun undoing everything my father built, and it has only been 6 months. What will you do, if the elders rule in your favor?" Rebuild what he started, Kale said without hesitation. Restore the alliances Silas has damaged through his paranoia and cruelty. Try to become the kind of leader my people deserve, rather than the kind they've been forced to endure. He glanced at her, something softer entering his expression. It will not be easy, and I cannot promise I will succeed at all of it, but I have to try. On the third night of their journey, disaster nearly found them. Elara woke to shouting and the clash of steel, scrambling out of her tent to find the camp under attack. Shadowy figures moving through the darkness with brutal efficiency, clearly sent by Silas to intercept Kale's party before they could reach the Elder's Hall. Chaos erupted around her, the disciplined guards fighting to hold their ground against attackers who had clearly planned their ambush with careful precision. Kale fought near the center of the fray, his repaired blade flashing in the firelight, with a speed and skill that spoke of years of training, cutting through the confusion, with a focused determination that left no doubt about his identity, as a warrior born and raised for exactly this kind of danger. Elara pressed herself against a tree, heart pounding, watching the battle unfold with a fear that made her limbs feel distant and unresponsive. One of the attackers broke through the guard's formation, moving directly toward her with clear intent, and Elara's training instincts, the ones her father had drilled into her during years of working with sharp tools and dangerous fire, finally kicked in. She grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, swinging it with desperate force as the attacker closed the distance, catching him hard enough across the shoulder to stagger his advance, just long enough for one of Kale's guards to intervene, driving the attacker back with a swift, decisive strike. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun, the surviving attackers retreating into the darkness once it became clear the ambush had failed to achieve its purpose. Kale's group had suffered injuries, 2 guards wounded seriously enough to require immediate attention, but no losses, a small mercy that did little to ease the tension now hanging over the camp. "Are you hurt?" Kale asked, finding Elara moments later, his expression tight with worry as he checked her over for injuries despite her assurances that she was unharmed. "I'm fine," she said, though her hands were still shaking from adrenaline. "Just startled. That was—" She struggled to find words adequate to the fear that still gripped her chest. "That was terrifying." "I know," Kale said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should not have let this happen. I should have taken more precautions, chosen a safer route." "You couldn't have known they would find us," Elara said, though the assurance did little to ease the tension in his shoulders. Ivy joined them moments later, her expression grim, despite the relatively minor casualties. "Silas is more desperate than we realized," she said. "He would not risk an open attack this close to the Elder's territory, unless he genuinely fears what will happen if this testimony reaches them." "That's a good sign, isn't it?" Elara asked. "If he's this afraid of us succeeding." "It's a good sign, and a dangerous one," Ivy said. "A cornered animal fights hardest when it has nothing left to lose. We should assume he will try again before we reach the hall." The remainder of the journey passed in tense, watchful silence, the group moving with heightened caution, guards doubling their watches through each night, the easy conversations between Elara and Kale giving way to a shared, unspoken awareness of the danger surrounding them. But even amid the fear, something had solidified between them during that terrifying attack, a trust forged in the heat of shared danger that neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though it lived in the careful way Kale positioned himself near her during moments of vulnerability, and the way Elara found herself watching for his safety as much as her own, whenever tension rippled through the group. On the morning of the 4th day, they crested a final ridge, and the northern hall came into view below them, an enormous structure of dark stone built into the mountainside itself, banners bearing the wolf's head emblem snapping in the cold wind above its towers. Elara felt her breath catch at the sheer scale of it, the weight of what waited within those walls settling fully over her for the first time. "That's it," Kale said quietly, his voice carrying a complicated mixture of longing and dread. "My home, or what used to be, before Silas twisted it into something else." "Are you ready for this?" Elara asked. Kale looked at her, something steady and resolute settling into his expression, despite the exhaustion and fear of the past days. "I have to be," he said. "For my father's memory, for the people still suffering under Silas's rule, and now, for the risk you've chosen to take alongside me. There is no version of this where I allow myself to be anything less than ready." Together, they began the final descent toward the hall, the weight of everything that awaited them inside, settling over the group like a held breath, waiting to be released. The northern hall was even more imposing up close than it had appeared from the ridge, its dark stone walls rising 3 stories above a courtyard filled with guards, servants, and pack members who paused their work to watch the arriving party with open curiosity and, in several cases, poorly hidden hope. Ilara noticed the way people's eyes lingered on Cale as they passed, murmurs rippling through the crowd that carried more than simple recognition, something closer to cautious relief, as though his return signaled a possibility many had assumed was already lost. "They know who you are," she observed quietly, as they dismounted in the courtyard. "Word travels fast in a place this size," Cale said, though his attention was already shifting toward the great doors at the top of a wide stone staircase, where a small group of figures had emerged to observe their arrival, with expressions far less welcoming than the general crowd, especially when Silas has spent months trying to convince everyone, "I am either dead or too weak to matter." The man at the center of that unwelcoming group was unmistakably Silas, sharing enough of Cale's features that the family resemblance was immediately apparent, though where Cale's expression carried warmth even beneath its careful guardedness, Silas's face held only cold, calculating assessment. He was older, his dark hair threaded with gray, his posture radiating the kind of practiced authority that came from years of commanding obedience rather than earning respect. "Nephew," Silas called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, pitched deliberately, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear every word. "How wonderful that you have finally decided to grace us with your presence again. We had all begun to fear the worst." "I imagine some of us feared it more than others," Cale replied evenly, though Ilara could feel the tension radiating from him, even without looking directly at his face. "Though I suspect my continued survival is rather less welcome to you than to the rest of the pack." A ripple of tension moved through the watching crowd at the open hostility in the exchange, though Silas's expression barely shifted, his composure a well-practiced mask that revealed nothing of whatever calculations moved behind his eyes. "Such accusations, and in front of so many witnesses. You always did have a flair for drama, even as a boy." "We are not here to trade accusations," Ivy interjected smoothly, stepping forward with the easy authority of long experience navigating exactly this kind of tense political theater. "Cale has come to present his claim before the elders, as is his right by law and tradition, nothing more." "Of course," Silas said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "The elders have been informed, and are prepared to receive you tomorrow morning, once you've had time to rest from your journey. I trust it was uneventful?" The pointed question hung in the air, and Ilara understood immediately that he was fishing for confirmation of the attack, perhaps even taking quiet satisfaction in whatever damage it had caused. Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he answered. "Eventful enough," he said simply, refusing to give Silas the satisfaction of a more detailed response. "But we are here, whole and ready, which I suspect was not the outcome you were hoping for." Something flickered across Silas's face then, gone too quickly for Ilara to fully identify, though the brief tightening around his eyes suggested Cale's words had landed closer to the truth than either man was willing to openly acknowledge in front of witnesses. Silas's gaze shifted then, settling on Ilara with an assessing curiosity that made her skin prickle with unease. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone shifting to something falsely pleasant. "You did not travel alone, I see." "Ilara Finch," Cale said, before Ilara could answer for herself. "A smith who will be providing testimony relevant to my claim." Silas's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than felt comfortable, something calculating moving behind his composed expression. "How fascinating," he said finally. "The elders do love a good story to accompany their proceedings. I look forward to hearing what she has to say." The threat, thinly veiled beneath politeness, was not lost on Ilara, and she felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Silas turned away without further comment, his small entourage following him back into the hall, leaving the courtyard tension slowly beginning to ease as the immediate confrontation dissolved. "He knows exactly who I am now," Ilara said quietly, once Silas was safely out of earshot, "that I fixed the sword." "He suspected before we arrived," Cale admitted grimly. "The ambush was proof enough of that, but confirmation changes things. He'll try something before tomorrow's proceedings, I have no doubt of it." "What kind of something?" Ilara asked, unease tightening further in her chest. "I don't know," Cale said honestly. but we will need to be careful tonight. More careful than usual. Ivy arranged for Alara to be housed in a chamber close to Cale's own quarters, with guards stationed discreetly nearby, though the precaution did little to fully settle Alara's nerves as evening fell over the hall, and the weight of tomorrow's proceedings pressed heavier with each passing hour. She spent the remaining daylight reviewing everything she planned to say before the elders, running through the details of the repair again and again in her mind, determined that nothing about her testimony would leave room for doubt or manipulation. Cale found her just after sunset, standing at the small window of her chamber, watching the last light fade over the mountains beyond the hall's walls. He knocked softly before entering, his expression carrying a weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Nervous," Alara admitted. "I've never spoken in front of anyone important before, let alone a group of elders deciding the fate of an entire territory." "You'll be exactly what the situation requires," Cale said, with a confidence that Alara wished she could fully share. "Honest, direct, unwilling to be intimidated. I've seen enough of that already to know it's true." "I hope you're right." She turned to face him fully, studying the tension still visible in the set of his shoulders. "What about you? You're the one whose entire future depends on tomorrow." Cale was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with thoughts he seemed reluctant to fully voice. "I keep thinking about my father," he finally said, wondering what he would say if he could see me now, walking back into this hall to claim what should have been mine without question, forced to prove myself before elders who watched me grow up simply because Silas has spent 6 months poisoning the truth. "He would be proud of you," Alara said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "For fighting for what's right, even when it would have been easier to disappear and let Silas keep what he stole." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a vulnerability breaking briefly through the careful composure he had maintained since their arrival. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that more than I realized." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of tomorrow settling around them both, before Cale finally spoke again, his voice softer now, more hesitant than Alara had heard from him before. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that meeting you was not simply fortunate timing. You could have turned me away that night. Most people would have, and I would not have blamed them. But you didn't, and everything that has happened since, all of it, has only deepened my gratitude into something I find myself struggling to put into words." Alara felt warmth rise in her cheeks despite the tension of the moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed fully ready to name aloud. "I'm glad I didn't turn you away," she said simply, honestly. Cale held her gaze for a long moment, something soft and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before, not even during the quiet conversations of their journey north. "So am I," he said finally, before seeming to catch himself, stepping back slightly, his composure reasserting itself even as warmth still lingered in his eyes. "Rest well tonight. Tomorrow will demand everything we both have to give." He left her chamber shortly after, and Alara remained by the window for a long while afterward, watching the stars emerge slowly over the dark silhouette of the mountains, her heart carrying a complicated mixture of fear and something warmer, something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Whatever tomorrow held, she understood now with complete certainty that she had crossed a threshold she could not fully return from, bound now to Cale's fate in ways that extended far beyond the simple debt of a repaired sword. Sleep found her eventually, though it was thin and restless, filled with half-formed dreams of firelight and cold mountain halls, and somewhere beneath the surface of her uneasy rest, a quiet certainty that tomorrow would change everything, one way or another, beyond any possibility of returning to the simple, quiet life she had left behind in Millbrook. Morning arrived too quickly, gray light filtering through the narrow window of Alara's chamber, long before she felt ready to face what waited beyond it. She dressed carefully in clothes Ivy had provided the night before, simple but well-made, suited to standing before a council of elders without appearing either underdressed or falsely elevated beyond her station. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the final clasp, and she took a long, steadying breath before finally opening her door to find Ivy already waiting in the corridor. "Nervous?" Ivy asked, though her tone carried understanding rather than judgment. "Terrified," Alara admitted honestly. "Good," Ivy said, surprising her. "It means you understand exactly how much is riding on today. Fear sharpens focus. if you let it. Just remember to speak plainly and honestly, and you will serve Kale's cause better than any rehearsed speech could manage." They made their way through the hall's stone corridors, toward the great council chamber, where the elders had already begun to gather, an assembly of 7 weathered figures seated along a raised platform, at the far end of a room, large enough to hold the entire watching pack. Kale stood near the center of the chamber, dressed formally now in dark clothing that carried his family's emblem, the repaired sword strapped visibly across his back, its silver seam catching the light from tall windows lining the chamber's walls. Silas stood on the opposite side, flanked by several supporters whose expressions ranged from confident to carefully neutral, watching the proceedings with the patient calculation of a man who believed he still held every advantage despite the morning's tension. The eldest of the council, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, called the gathering to order, with a voice that carried effortlessly across the crowded chamber. "We gather today to hear the claim of Kale, son of the late Alpha King, against the current leadership of Silas, brother to the deceased and acting regent these past 6 months. Kale, you may present your case." Kale stepped forward, and Alara watched as the nervous young man who had knocked so desperately at her forge door weeks ago transformed into something steadier, more commanding, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber as he laid out the events of his father's murder, his own narrow escape, and the long months spent healing and gathering allies, before finally being ready to return and formally challenge his uncle's claim. "The proof of my identity, and my right to inherit, lies in the ancestral blade my family has carried since the founding of this territory," Kale continued, drawing the sword and holding it aloft for the council to examine. "It was shattered the night my father was murdered, broken beyond what I believed any smith could repair. I present it now whole, restored by hands skilled enough to work with metal that has defeated lesser craftsmen for generations." A murmur moved through the watching crowd, and Silas stepped forward quickly, his expression shifting into something sharper, more urgent. "A convenient claim," he said, his voice carrying practiced skepticism. "How can this council be certain the blade presented today is authentic, and not some clever forgery meant to deceive us all?" "That is precisely why I have brought a witness," Kale said, turning toward Alara with a steadying glance that seemed to carry both apology and encouragement in equal measure. "Alara Finch, the smith who performed the repair, is here to testify to the nature of the work and the authenticity of the metal itself." Every eye in the chamber turned toward Alara, and she felt the full weight of that collective attention settle over her like a physical force. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady beneath her, and forced herself to focus on the elders' faces, rather than the pressure of the wider crowd. "Speak freely," the silver-haired elder said, her voice gentler now, though no less commanding. "Tell us what you witnessed." Alara took a steadying breath and began, describing the night Kale had arrived at her forge, the strange resistance of the metal to ordinary repair techniques, the faint symbols that seemed to respond to heat in ways she had never encountered before, the careful, painstaking hours it had taken to finally rejoin the shattered pieces. She spoke plainly, exactly as Ivy had advised, resisting the urge to embellish or exaggerate, trusting the simple truth of her experience to carry its own weight. "The metal itself is unlike anything I have worked with in my years as a smith," she said, addressing the elders directly. "It resisted ordinary heat, required a gentler, more careful approach than any blade I've repaired before. I do not know what to call whatever quality it possesses, but I can tell you, with complete certainty, that it is not an ordinary sword, and the work required to repair it was not something easily faked or forged." Silas's expression tightened as she spoke, and when she finished, he stepped forward with renewed urgency. "A moving account," he said, though his tone carried clear skepticism. "But this council cannot simply take the word of a smith with no prior connection to this family, whose testimony conveniently supports my nephew's claim, after he apparently sought her out specifically for that purpose." "I did not seek her out," Kale interjected sharply. "She had no idea who I was when I arrived at her forge, wounded and carrying nothing that would identify me. She helped me because it was the right thing to do, not because of any connection to this council or this family." "So you claim," Silas said, "though I imagine a smith paid handsomely enough might say whatever is required of her." The accusation stung, and Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed, addressing the elders directly, rather than allowing Silas's provocation to derail her focus. I was offered payment that night, she said clearly. A ring, which I refused. I did not know who Cale was, what he stood to inherit, or what testifying here today might mean for either of us, until well after the repair was already complete. I have gained nothing from this, beyond the danger it has brought to my own life, including an ambush on the road that nearly cost several people their lives. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the chamber at this revelation, and Alara saw several of the elders exchange meaningful glances, clearly troubled by the implication that violence had already been employed against Cale's party before the proceedings had even begun. An ambush, the silver-haired elder repeated, her sharp eyes settling on Silas with pointed weight. Do you have knowledge of this incident? I know nothing of any ambush, Silas said quickly, though something flickered across his expression that suggested the denial was less than fully convincing. If my nephew was attacked on the road, it was likely bandits, or perhaps enemies from beyond our territory, taking advantage of the current uncertainty. How fortunate for you, Cale said coldly, that bandits chose exactly the route we were traveling, at exactly the time that would prevent us from reaching this council. The chamber fell into tense silence, the accusation hanging heavy in the air between them, and Alara could see the careful calculation moving behind the elders' expressions as they weighed the implications of everything laid before them. The silver-haired elder finally raised a hand, calling for quiet before addressing the full council. We have heard testimony from both parties, she said. The council will withdraw to consider the evidence presented, including the authenticity of the blade and the concerning claims of violence along the road. We will return with our judgment before evening falls. The elders rose in unison and filed out through a side door, leaving the chamber in a state of restless, murmuring tension. Silas cast one final cold glance toward Cale and Alara before turning to leave with his own supporters, his composed mask slipping just enough to reveal the sharp anger simmering beneath it. That went better than I feared, Ivy said quietly, once Silas had departed. The elders are not easily swayed by empty accusations, and your testimony landed exactly as we hoped it would. It's not over yet, Cale said, though there was cautious relief in his voice as well. But it's a start. Alara let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, the tension of the morning finally beginning to ease from her shoulders, though the weight of what still lay ahead, the elder's final judgment, Silas's clear willingness to resort to violence, kept any true relief from fully settling in. Whatever came next, she understood now more clearly than ever that there would be no simple, easy resolution to the storm she had chosen to stand within. The hours between the council's withdrawal and their promised return stretched long and tense, the entire hall seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of a verdict that would determine far more than a simple inheritance dispute. Alara spent the time pacing the small courtyard garden Ivy had shown her, trying and failing to settle the anxious energy that refused to leave her body no matter how she tried to distract herself. Cale found her there in the late afternoon, his own composure visibly strained despite his efforts to project calm confidence. Any word? She asked, though she already suspected the answer from the tension still evident in his shoulders. Not yet, he said. The waiting is always the hardest part. I remember watching my father endure council decisions when I was young, the way he would pace exactly like you're pacing now, though he always hit it better once anyone else entered the room. I don't think I've inherited that particular skill, Alara admitted, managing a small, tired smile despite the tension. They walked together through the garden in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon light slanting gold through bare autumn branches, before Cale finally spoke again, his voice carrying a seriousness that pulled Ilara's full attention. Whatever the elders decide, he said, I need you to know that Silas will not simply accept an unfavorable ruling gracefully. If the council rules in my favor, he may attempt something desperate before the transition of power can be properly secured. I want you prepared for that possibility. What kind of desperate? Alara asked, unease tightening in her chest. I don't know for certain, Cale admitted, but given what he has already shown himself willing to do, an ambush on the road, murdering his own brother for power, I would be foolish to assume he'll simply walk away quietly if he loses this council's support. Before Alara could respond further, a runner appeared at the garden's entrance, breathless and urgent. The council has reached its decision, he announced. You are both requested back in the main chamber immediately. They made their way back through the hall's stone corridors with hurried steps, Ilara's heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread as they entered the chamber to find it fuller than before. Word of the impending verdict having drawn nearly the entire pack to witness the moment. Silas stood in his previous position, his expression carefully composed, though Ilara noticed the tight set of his jaw that suggested he was bracing for news he did not want to hear. The silver-haired elder rose once the chamber had settled into expectant silence, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. After careful consideration of all testimony presented, including the physical evidence of the ancestral blade, and the deeply concerning claims regarding an armed attack upon Kale's party, this council finds sufficient grounds to recognize Kale as the rightful heir to his father's position, effective immediately. A roar of sound erupted through the chamber, cheers and applause mixing with gasps of surprise, the weight of 6 months of uncertainty finally breaking in a wave of relief that swept visibly through the gathered crowd. Ilara felt her own eyes fill with unexpected tears, watching Kale's expression shift from tense anticipation to something raw and overwhelmed. Years of grief and struggle finally finding vindication in this single moment. But even amid the celebration, Ilara's attention caught on Silas, whose composed mask had finally shattered completely, his face twisted with a fury that promised the danger was far from over. Before anyone could react, he moved, his hand flying to the hilt of a hidden blade, lunging not toward Kale directly, surrounded as he was by supporters and guards, but toward Ilara, standing slightly apart from the protective crowd. Chaos erupted instantly. Kale moved faster than Ilara would have believed possible, closing the distance between them with desperate speed, his own blade already drawn, intercepting Silas's attack just before it could reach her. Steel rang against steel, the sound cutting sharply through the shocked silence that had fallen over the chamber. And for a terrifying moment, uncle and nephew stood locked in a struggle that carried the full weight of 6 months of grief and betrayal behind every desperate strike. Guards moved quickly to intervene, but Kale's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stand back. This ends now, properly, before witnesses, not through some coward's ambush in a crowded room." The guards hesitated, then obeyed, forming a wide circle around the two men, rather than intervening directly, while Ilara watched with her heart in her throat, pressed back against the chamber wall by Ivy's protective grip, unable to look away from the desperate battle unfolding before her. Silas fought with the cornered ferocity of a man who understood he had nothing left to lose, but Kale's training, honed through years of preparation for exactly this kind of leadership, proved steadier, more controlled. The repaired blade moved with a precision that seemed to carry more than simple skill behind it, as though the ancient metal itself lent strength to the man who had fought so hard to reclaim it. The end came swiftly. Silas overextended in a desperate final strike, and Kale's counter was decisive, disarming his uncle with a swift, controlled motion that sent Silas's blade clattering across the stone floor, leaving him kneeling, defeated, before the entire assembled pack. "It's over," Kale said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber, breathless but steady. "You murdered my father, tried to have me killed to secure your claim, and just now attempted to harm an innocent woman in front of this entire council, rather than accept a fair judgment. There is no path back from that." The silver-haired elder stepped forward then, her expression grave. "Silas, son of the former Alpha King, you stand condemned before this council for the murder of your own brother and the attempted murder of his rightful heir, crimes further compounded by your attack witnessed here today. This council strips you of all rank and privilege, effective immediately, and remands you to imprisonment pending final judgment." Guards moved forward to take Silas into custody, his earlier composure completely gone now, replaced by a hollow, defeated expression that seemed to age him years in the span of a few moments. He offered no further resistance as he was led from the chamber, the crowd parting around him in a silence heavier than any words could have carried. Once he was gone, the tension in the chamber finally began to break, replaced by a swelling wave of relief and celebration that Ilara could feel moving through the crowd like a physical force. Kale sheathed his blade and turned immediately to Ilara, closing the distance between them with quick, urgent steps. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though needing physical confirmation that she was truly unharmed. "I'm fine," Ilara said, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. You got to me in time. I would not have forgiven myself if I hadn't, Cale said, and the raw honesty in his voice, the depth of relief evident in his expression, told her more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much her safety had come to matter to him. Around them, the chamber continued to fill with celebration, the pack finally free of 6 months of fear and uncertainty, but Alara found her attention entirely absorbed by the man standing before her, his eyes still searching hers with a mixture of gratitude and something warmer, something that had been building quietly between them since the very first night she had opened her forge door to a desperate, wounded stranger. "Thank you," Cale said softly, "for everything, for that first night, for coming here despite the danger, for standing beside me through all of this when you had every reason to walk away. I do not know how I will ever properly repay what you've given me." "You don't have to repay it," Alara said, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks ago in her quiet forge, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now, charged with a significance neither of them fully needed to voice aloud. "I chose to be here. All of it, every part of it, was my choice." Something passed between them then, unspoken but unmistakable, and though the celebration continued to swell around them, filling the chamber with noise and relief, Alara felt, for a long, quiet moment, as though the two of them stood entirely alone, the weight of everything they had endured together, finally settling into something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of a new story, rather than the end of an old one. 3 weeks passed before Alara found herself standing once more in the Northern Hall's great chamber, though this time the mood carried none of the tension that had defined her first visit. The chamber had been transformed for a formal ceremony, banners bearing the wolf's head emblem hanging fresh and vibrant along every wall. The entire pack gathered to witness Cale's formal investiture as Alpha King, the title finally settled beyond any question or challenge. She had returned to Millbrook briefly after the confrontation with Silas, needing time to process everything that had happened, to reassure Wren that she had survived whatever danger she had walked into, to sit once more at her familiar anvil and remind herself of the ordinary rhythms that had defined her life before that fateful night. But the quiet forge that had once felt like enough had begun to feel different somehow, smaller, as though she had outgrown the boundaries of the life she had built there without fully realizing it, until she returned to it. Cale had written to her twice during those 3 weeks, careful letters that spoke of the work required to stabilize the territory after Silas's fall, the slow process of repairing alliances damaged by months of paranoid, fearful leadership, and, threaded quietly through each letter, an invitation to return for his formal investiture, an invitation that carried more weight in its careful phrasing than either of them had yet been ready to name directly. Now, standing near the front of the crowded chamber, watching Cale kneel before the Council of Elders to receive the formal blessing that would confirm his place as Alpha King, Alara felt a swell of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. The silver-haired elder placed a hand upon Cale's bowed head, speaking words in an old language Alara did not understand, and when he finally rose, the repaired sword held aloft once more, the crowd erupted into cheers that shook the very stones of the ancient hall. Cale's eyes found hers immediately across the crowded chamber, and even amid the overwhelming celebration surrounding him, he held her gaze for a long moment, something warm and certain passing between them that needed no further words to carry its meaning. Ivy, standing beside Alara, noticed the exchange with a knowing smile that suggested she had anticipated this outcome long before either of the two people at its center had fully allowed themselves to acknowledge it. The celebration continued long into the evening, the entire hall filled with music and laughter, and the particular joy of a people finally free from months of fear, and Alara found herself swept along in it, introduced to pack members eager to thank her personally for the role she had played in restoring their rightful leader, her name already becoming woven into the story that would be told and retold throughout the territory for years to come. It was well past midnight when Cale finally found a quiet moment to draw her aside from the celebration, leading her out onto a wide stone balcony that overlooked the mountains beyond the hall, the cold night air carrying the last echoes of music and laughter from the chamber behind them. "I have thought about this moment for weeks," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness that seemed almost out of place for a man who had just been formally confirmed as Alpha King before his entire assembled pack. "I am not entirely certain how to say what I want to say." "You could just try saying it plainly," Alara suggested, echoing the advice Ivy had once given her before her own difficult testimony, and Cale's answering laugh carried genuine warmth despite his lingering nerves. Fair enough. He took a steadying breath, his eyes finding hers with an openness she had rarely seen from him, even during their most honest conversations. That night you fixed my sword. I was a stranger to you, wounded and desperate, carrying nothing but a debt I was not certain I would ever be able to repay. I told myself, walking away from your forge that morning, that our paths had likely crossed only once, that whatever gratitude I carried would remain simply that, gratitude for a kindness I had not expected to receive. But it didn't stay that way, Ilara said softly, already sensing where his careful words were leading. No, Cale agreed. It became something far more complicated than gratitude, somewhere along the road north, somewhere between an ambush that nearly cost us everything, and quiet conversations by countless campfires. Somewhere in the way you stood before that council, terrified, but unwilling to back down. Somewhere in the moment I understood, with absolute certainty, that I could not have imagined facing any of this without you standing beside me. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that chased away the cold mountain air entirely. I felt it too, she admitted. Somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like a debt I helped repay, and started feeling like exactly where I was meant to be. Cale reached out, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that carried the full weight of everything unspoken between them for weeks. I know this is not the simple, quiet life you built for yourself in Millbrook, he said. I know that whatever future exists between us would ask a great deal of you, would carry responsibilities and dangers that have nothing to do with the forge you grew up loving. I would never ask you to give that up entirely, or to pretend those challenges do not exist. I don't need simple, Ilara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I spent my whole life content with quiet, and I don't regret a single day of it, but I have never once, in all these weeks, wished I had turned you away that first night. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges wait for us, I would rather face them standing beside you than return to a quiet life that no longer feels like enough. The smile that broke across Cale's face then held none of the careful guardedness that had defined him during their first meeting, nothing but open, unrestrained warmth as he drew her closer, the cold mountain night wrapping around them both, while the celebration continued unseen behind the balcony doors. Then perhaps, he said softly, we might discover together exactly what kind of life we're meant to build, one that honors both where we've each come from and where we hope to go. Ilara felt a smile spread across her own face, matching his, as she looked out over the mountains stretching into darkness beyond the hall, the same mountains that had seemed so foreign and frightening only weeks before, now carrying the quiet promise of a future she had never imagined for herself, forged from a single act of kindness, offered freely to a desperate stranger on an ordinary, rainy night. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued, the Northern Territory beginning its long, hopeful journey back toward the stability and fairness it had lost, guided now by a king who understood, more deeply than most, the true value of an honest kindness offered without expectation of return. And standing beside him on that cold stone balcony, Ilara understood that the broken sword she had repaired that first desperate night had mended far more than simple metal. It had forged a bond neither of them had anticipated, one strong enough to carry them both through whatever challenges still lay ahead, together, into whatever future waited beyond the mountains.